Nature 14,469, that, according to the astronomer J.R. Hind, Benjamin Scott, City Chamberlain of London, and Mr. Ray had in 1847 seen a body similar to Vulcan cross the sun. Similar observation by Hind and Lowe, March 12, 1849. L'Année Scientifique, 1876-9. Nature 14,505. Body of apparent size of Mercury seen January 29, 1860 by F.A.R. Russell and 4 other observers crossing the sun. De Vico's observation of July 12, 1837. Observatory 2,424. L'Année Scientifique, 1865-16. That another amateur astronomer, M. Combray of Constantinople, had written to Leverrier that upon the 8th of March, 1865, he had seen a black point sharply outlined traverse the disk of the sun. It detached itself from a group of sunspots near the limb of the sun and took 48 minutes to reach the other limb. Figuring upon the diagram sent by M. Combray, a central passage would have taken a little more than an hour. This observation was disregarded by Leverrier because his formula required about 4 times that velocity. The point here is that these other observations are as authentic as those that Leverrier included, that then, upon data as good as the data of Vulcan, there must be other Vulcans. The heroic and defiant disregard, then, of trying to formulate one, omitting the others, which by orthodox doctrine must have influenced it greatly, if all were in the relatively narrow space between Mercury and the Sun. Observation upon another such body of April 4th, 1876, by M. Weber of Berlin. As to this observation, Leverrier was informed by Wolf in August 1876, L'Année Scientifique, 1876-7. It made no difference, so far as can be shown, to this notable positivist. 2 other observations noted by Hind and Denning, London Times, November 3, 1871, and March 26, 1873. Monthly Notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, 2100. Standacker, February 1762. Lichtenberg, November 19, 1762. Hoffman, May 1764. Dango, January 18, 1798. Stark, February 12, 1820. An observation by Schmidt, October 11, 1847, is said to be doubtful, but upon page 192, it is said that this doubt had arisen because of a mistaken translation, and 2 other observations by Schmidt are given, October 14, 1849, and February 18, 1850. Also, an observation by Loft, January 6, 1818. Observation by Steinheipel at Vienna, April 27, 1820. Monthly Notices, 1862. Hasse had collected reports of 20 observations, like Lescarbault's. The list was published in 1872 by Wolf. Also, there are other instances like Gruthinsen's. American Journal of Science, 2/28/446. Report by Pastorff that he had seen twice in 1836 and once in 1837 2 round spots of unequal size moving across the sun, changing position relatively to each other and taking a different course, if not orbit. Each time that, in 1834, he had seen similar bodies pass 6 times across the disk of the Sun, looking very much like Mercury in his transits. March 22, 1876. But to point out Leverrier's poverty-stricken average, or discovering planets upon a 50% basis, would be to point out the low percentage of realness in the quasi-myth stuff of which the whole system is composed. We do not accuse the textbooks of omitting this fiasco, but we do note that theirs is the conventional adaptation here of all beguilers who are in difficulties. The diverting of attention. It wouldn't be possible in a real existence, with real mentality, to deal with, but I suppose it's good enough for the quasi-intellects that stupefy themselves with textbooks. The trick here is to gloss over Leverrier's mistake and blame Lescarbault. He was only an amateur. Had delusions. The reader's attention is led against Lescarbault by a report from M. Lias, director of the Brazilian Coast Survey, who at the time of Lescarbault's supposed observation had been watching the sun in Brazil, and instead of seeing even ordinary sunspots, had noted that the region of the supposed transit was of uniform intensity. But the meaninglessness of all utterances and quasi-existence. Uniform intensity turns our way as much as against us. Or someday some brain will conceive a way of beating Newton's third law, if every reaction or resistance is or can be interpretable as stimulus instead of resistance. If this could be done in mechanics, there's a way open here for someone to own the world. Specifically in this matter, uniform intensity means that Lescarbault saw no ordinary sunspot, just as much as it means that no spot at all was seen upon the sun. Continuing the interpretation of a resistance as an assistance, which can always be done with mental forces, making us wonder what applications could be made with steam and electric forces. We point out that invisibility in Brazil means parallax quite as truly as it means absence, and inasmuch as Vulcan was supposed to be distant from the sun, we interpret denial as corroboration. Method, of course, of every scientist, politician, theologian, high school debater. So the textbooks, with no especial cleverness, because no especial cleverness is needed, lead the reader into contempt for the amateur of Auger and forgetfulness of Leverrier, and some other subject is taken up. But our own acceptance that these data are as good as ever they were, that if someone of eminence should predict an earthquake, and if there should be no earthquake at the predicted time, that would discredit the prophet, but data of past earthquakes would remain as good as ever they had been. It is easy enough to smile at the illusion of a single amateur. The mass formation. Fritzsche, Stark, De Cuppis, Sidebottom, Lescarbault, Loomis, Gruthinson, De Vico, Scott, Ray, Russell, Hind, Lowe, Cumbray, Weber, Stondacker, Lichtenberg, Dango, Hoffmann, Schmidt, Loft, Steinheibel, Pastorff. These are only the observations conventionally listed relatively to an intramercurial planet. They are formidable enough to prevent our being diverted, as if it were all the dream of a lonely amateur, but they're a mere advance guard. From now on, other data of large celestial bodies, some dark and some reflecting light, will pass and pass and keep on passing, so that some of us will remember a thing or two after the procession's over, possibly, taking up only one of the listed observations. Or our impression that the discrediting of Leverrier has nothing to do with the acceptability of these data. In the London Times, January 10, 1860, is Benjamin Scott's account of his observation. That, in the summer of 1847, he had seen a body that had seemed to be the size of Venus crossing the sun. He says that, hardly believing the evidence of his sense of sight, he had looked for someone whose hopes or ambitions would not make him so subject to illusion. He had told his little son, aged 5 years, to look through the telescope. The child had exclaimed that he had seen a little balloon crossing the sun. Scott says that he had not had sufficient self-reliance to make public announcement of his remarkable observation at the time, but that in the evening of the same day he had told Dr. Dick, F.R.A.S., who had cited other instances. In the Times, January 12, 1860, is published a letter from Richard Abbott, F.R.A.S., that he remembered Mr. Scott's letter to him upon this observation at the time of the occurrence. I suppose that at the beginning of this chapter one had the notion that by hard scratching through musty old records we might rake up vague, more than doubtful data, distortable into what's called evidence of unrecognized worlds or constructions of planetary size. But the high authenticity and the support and the modernity of these of the accursed that we are now considering, and our acceptance that ours is a quasi-existence in which, above all other things, hopes, ambitions, emotions, motivations, stands, attempt to positivize. That we are here considering an attempt to systematize. That is sheer fanaticism in its disregard of the unsystematizable. That it represented the highest good in the 19th century, that is monomania, but heroic monomania that was quasi-divine in the 19th century. But that this isn't the 19th century. As a doubly sponsored Brahmin in the regard of Baptists, the objects of July 29, 1878 stand out and proclaim themselves so that nothing but disregard of the intensity of monomania can account for their reception by the system. Or the total eclipse of July 29, 1878, and the reports by Professor Watson from Rawlins, Wyoming, and by Professor Swift from Denver, Colorado, that they had seen two shining objects at a considerable distance from the sun. It's quite in accord with our general expression, not that there is an intramercurial planet, but that there are different bodies, many vast things, near this earth, sometimes near the sun, sometimes orbitless worlds, which, because of scarcely any data of collisions, we think of as under navigable control, or dirigible superconstructions. Professor Watson and Professor Swift published their observations. Then the disregard that we cannot think of in terms of ordinary sane exclusions. The textbook systematists begin by telling us that the trouble with these observations is that they disagree widely. There's considerable respectfulness, especially for Professor Swift, but we are told that by coincidence these two astronomers, hundreds of miles apart, were eluded. Their observations were so different. Professor Swift, Nature, September 19, 1878, that his own observation was in close approximation to that given by Professor Watson. In the observatory 2-161, Swift says that his observations and Watson's were confirmatory of each other.